Okay, the thing that I'm trying to do here has taken a sharp right turn. So what I had originally planned to do tonight was to talk about, to go back through Western history and show you how we get from uh, trust to distrust over and over again. It's just like these cycles we go through in human history, and how we are at the end of a cycle. So we are in an era of extreme distrust. And but I had to scrap that because as I was reviewing lectures 1 and 2, and then preparing to make a transition, I realized there was a very important piece that belongs in the prolegomena, that is in the introductory material prior to actually doing theology. And that this material is essential because, again, it all relates to the category of trust. Now, I pointed out to you that there's lots of starting points that people can use when it comes to doing Christian theology. And I made the case that when we begin, like Paul says, with pistis, with trust, that we're actually beginning not with something unique, but with something that is part and part of the warp and woof of our social existence. Everything we do in relation to one another is in relation to the amount of trust or distrust we have. Everything. And then I went on to try and show that in various different spheres: the social, the economic, and parenting, and how important trust was in early childhood development. And then last week I distinguished, or I showed how the West distinguished between the faith by which I believe and the faith in which I believe. And then we talked about trust and reason, and we're going to come back to this business of trust and reason again. But there, what I showed was that there is not a dichotomy between trust and reason when they are rightly related. Unfortunately, they are often seen as a binary or as a dualism. And so I started to talk last week about how even modern science uses the same epistemology as that uncovered by Athanasius to unlock the doctrine of the Trinity. And I pointed out this was one of the benefits of the work of Karl Barth and Tom Torrance. And then finally, we talked about trust and the gospel. Now, this week, what I want to do is I want to note in very particular ways some very clear relationships that you will be familiar with as we talk about our relationship with I say the Father. You'll notice I don't say God much. I don't have a relationship with a God. The one that I know is the Papa, the Abba. I don't have like a God concept, in other words, that I believe in. Although I understand why people would want to call my father a God. You understand what I'm saying? So we're going to discuss this. We're going to get into anthropology, religion, economics tonight, the postmodern world, and then we're going to have some real fun with Tom Torrance's brother, J.B. Torrance. I don't know if any of you know who Tom Torrance is. I don't know if any of you know who J.B. is, but when we get there, I'll certainly set that up for you. So there's an excellent book, just simply called Debt, the First 5,000 Years. You think, well, that's an odd place to begin, Michael. Except, as we'll note a little bit later, there's fundamentally little distinction between religious language and economic language. But we'll get to that. But the reason this book has been important is the author argues that when we are in relationship with each other, we're normally in one of three modalities: that of communism, and not modern Marxist communism, but, for example, the relation that a child has with a parent is communistic. That is, the state, the parent, simply gives to the child and raises the child, and there's nothing expected in return. You with me? Except for chores and obedience, in theory. And then he talks about relationships of exchange, and that tends to involve equals. And then he talks about hierarchy, that is relationships between unequal people, a king, retainers, servants, and the peasants, and the hierarchy. You could think of the caste system in India. You can certainly think of the various ways that economic inequality has hampered and hindered certain people groups in our own country as well as around the world. It's everywhere. So he has these three ways of relating trust in each relationship. Communism, that is, we're in relationship with each other. If one of my friends here, Keith or Steve or Derek or Anthony, or I mean, you're all my friends, but I've met some of you. If you ask me for something, I'd give it to you without a thought. It wouldn't be a debt, because that's the nature of the relationship. And the same vice versa. Then there are exchange relationships. Maybe Stephen comes to me and says, Michael, I've got a little project. Can I borrow $500 and I'll pay you 10% interest over the course of 50 months or whatever it is. That's a contractual legal relationship. And then there's hierarchy. And for this to work, I would probably have to pick Cher, because she's the lady in my life. And we men know that you always listen to the ladies because they're above you. And that's just kind of how it works. No, but that's the way, for example, knights would come and relate to the king. And the deal is, you can't give a gift to a king. Because if you do, you're going to obligate the king. And if you do it too many times, it becomes a precedent, and that precedent becomes a custom. So every time you come before the king, you have to give a gift. So these are all relationships that involve various degrees of trust. Trust is also tied to communication. I pointed out in the first talk, I think it was, where we talk about taking people at their word, or Jesus saying, let your yes be yes and your no be no. Again, growing up, the hardest thing to do was to keep faith with the parents when they said, where were you? Were you out drinking tonight? Oh, no, I was over Billy's, we distrust each other. Our words and our intentions and meanings are often hidden. They're subtle. And this is what makes things like sarcasm so excellent as devices. Third, the ground of trust matters. Who you trust or what you trust in matters. And this is the where we're going to run into a significant difficulty with regard to the gods. So when we start talking about the distinction between the gospel or revelation and religion down the road, you'll notice at this point that this question, the early Roman question, the question that would have been asked in Jesus' day was not, do you believe in God, but to which God do you sacrifice? That's the religious question. Now becomes, which God can you trust? And then, of course, the gospel proclaims that it's the Father of Jesus that's the trustworthy one. In order to get to another way of looking at trust is to think of it in terms of the two primordial myths around which the world has revolved in one form or another. And both these myths are ancient and modern. So, for example, the first type of myth is what's called the utopian myth. The utopian myth is that everything started out blissfully and we developed as a civilization and we called ourselves Atlantis. And we brought knowledge and wisdom to the world. Or perhaps the story might start off, we were all created wonderful, and then there were a group of us that were the watchers, and they passed on the wisdom and knowledge. There's these mythologies. There's Plato's, there's the Bibles, there's all these mythologies that start with utopia. That is, at some point, the human species was this lovely little group of people that all worked happily together. You understand what I'm saying here? Nod your heads, okay? The second myth is the myth that's found embedded in Genesis chapter 2, which describes a fall, a breakdown. That is, in the beginning, it was tohu vo bohu. It was chaos. It was disorder. And from disorder arose order. Now, the Genesis 1 text has order arising out of disorder apart from any kind of sacred violence, and that's what makes the Genesis 1 mythology so powerful. But the Genesis 2 text is already presupposing sacrifice in this world that's going to require it. So we have another mythology that's established, and that mythology in Genesis 2 becomes our way of feeling alienated from that utopian myth. And so as a species, every few generations, we are all trying to get back to the garden. I mean, that was huge in the time of Woodstock, right? It was huge in the Jesus movement, talking about getting back to the garden. And of course, the charismatic tradition has absolutely ruined that, and we won't go there. Now, I follow Rene Girard, as you know, and his understanding of religion as the mother of human culture. That is, before there is human culture, before we are working together to domesticate animals, raise crops, and these kinds of things, before that, there's religion. It is religion that exists as the cradle in which civilization is born. And Girard, of course, traces this back to the practice of human sacrifice and scapegoating and on, and most of you are familiar with this. The thing I want to observe here is precisely what the second biblical myth observes, and that's that Girard's argument that it's this practice, this ritual practice of human sacrifice over tens or 20s or 50s of thousands of years before it becomes institutionalized. And it's probably only institutionalized in certain pockets just after the ice age of the Dryas period, 11,000 years BCE. Then religion tends to get institutionalized, as we've seen in the archaeology of Tepe Göbekli, and then later Çatalhöyük around 7,500 BC. And then we know it in its earliest full flower from archaeological evidence from ancient Sumer and ancient China and ancient India. Okay, so we're talking 3,500 years BCE or the Bronze Age. This is the era we know it with texts, but it took literally tens of thousands of years to develop into an institution with priests, with ritual sacrifices that have all these laws that are followed, and on and on. In this religion, trust is grounded in fear. You trust that when the priests tell you the gods are going to get you, they're going to get you. You trust that when the witch tells you you've got bad omens, you've got bad omens. I mean, there is absolute trust in this religious authority. There are no atheists in the ancient world until we get to some of the early Greek philosophers. Otherwise, everybody's religious. Everybody's religious. Everybody believes in the gods, or the gods. Trust is grounded in fear. It's maintained through ritual. That is, you keep participating. You might go down to the temple and watch them sacrifice foreign prisoners and chop off their heads and roll them down the steps like Mel Gibson's Apocalypto. It's maintained by ritual. It's grounded in fear, maintained by ritual. but it gets submerged in mythology. And this is Girard's, one of Girard's real advantages, is to be able to note that we take this god-awful sacrificial practice, human sacrifice, and we submerge it into our mythologies. And then our mythologies is the way that we create our gods. In all these ancient texts, including the Torah, so we're talking the Sumerian, the Akkadian, the Egyptian texts, from the ancient Near East, the Ugaritic, and everything else, including the Jewish texts, religious language is identical with economic language. Even the word trust is an economic word. What is it that you can create with your extra money if you want? You can create a trust that has trustees. The word debt is both economic and moral or religious. The word redemption is an economic word. What do you do with coupons at a store or rebates? You redeem them. The reason this is important is that, and by the way, I'm working on a book on the Sermon on the Mount right now. I think most of you know that, with my friend Keith Hayes, who's here tonight somewhere. And we have discovered a real clear relationship in the sermon between money, debt, forgiveness, and Jesus' emphasis on trust in the Father. So we're very pumped about exploring this in the book, but it's important in this lecture because religious language and economic language are identical. And this means that religious language is transactional. And so I want you to think about the Greek term suntheke. Suntheke. A suntheke is a contract between two parties. There are agreements on both sides, and when both sides fulfill the agreement, the contract ceases to exist. How many of you have bought a home? You signed a contract. Bought a car, you signed a contract, right? Just about everything you do, if you join the Robinhood app to buy Bitcoin and you click terms and conditions, that's like signing a contract. And we sign our lives away. But a contract is where you're promising something and the fiduciary is promising something, and when you both have fulfilled your end of the bargain, then the contract is gone. This is very sadly how Christians understand the concept of covenant. Now, covenant is diatheke, contract is suntheke. They're both used in the Greek Old Testament to translate Hebrew terms, different Hebrew terms. But covenants are not contracts. It is true that ancient Near Eastern Hittite type covenants, from which the Jewish covenant is modeled on, contained this transactional language. But there is a shift between the relationship of the gods in the Hittite world and the peoples and that of the Jewish faith, because in the Jewish world, a covenant is unilateral. God says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. I redeemed you. You're in a new place. This is brand new. Therefore, you shall have no other gods before me here. You may have there, but not here. I've redeemed you. I brought you into this place where you won't have any other gods before me. I brought you into this place where you don't use my name foolishly. I brought, and on and on and on. And there are 10 of these rules. But a covenant is unilateral. God promises and executes that promise, irregardless of what the people say or do. Now, by the time we get to the book of Deuteronomy, this covenant has been turned into a contract. And you line the people up on the two mountains, and the one group says, if we do all these things, we get blessed. And the other says, if we don't do these things, we get cursed. And now you have brought covenants, you've turned this covenant-making God into a contractual God. And this is going to, if you haven't started ferreting this out yet, this becomes huge in Calvin and the Reformation. And why the God that most of us were raised with is not a covenant God, but a contract God. I first learned this in the summer of 1980 or 81. I don't remember which year. I lived about an hour and a half from Berkeley, and they were bringing in a Calvin scholar, and I could go spend a week there, and it was real cheap at the New School in Berkeley. And I could learn about Calvin from J.B. Torrance. Now, I know who J.B. was because I had been reading his brother Tom Torrance for a year or two at that point. And so I thought this was pretty cool, you know, and so I went and spent a week and learned Calvin there. And the thing J.B. did was he was working on, at that point, two very, very important essays on covenants and contracts. And at the same time, he was working through E.P. Sanders' Paul and Palestinian Judaism. And this is a class on Calvin. So we got this whole business of covenants and contracts from three different sides. The first essay I ever wrote was 1986 on covenants and contracts. So I'm revisiting something that goes back over 40 years for me here in terms of, you know, learning and research. But one of the things that JB pointed out to us was that in a contract, it's you have if you, then I. Whereas a covenant is because I, then you. You with me on this? That's a covenant. Now, JB at that point was really influenced by a Scottish theologian of the 19th century by the name of John MacLeod Campbell. Anybody know that name? Do I see any hands? No, okay. If you ever get a chance to read about John MacLeod Campbell and the controversy he caused, he was kicked out of the church. I'm going to talk about MacLeod Campbell in just about another 2 minutes here. But JB was crazy in love with MacLeod Campbell. And so over the next decade, whenever I found anything, you know, when I was at conventions or like the AARSBL big book exhibit and stuff, and I found something on MacLeod Campbell, I picked it up. But the reason that that MacLeod Campbell's important is because at this class on Calvin, JB's bringing in E.P. Sanders, whose book Paul and Palestinian Judaism will overturn Pauline studies. This book was published in 1978, Paul and Palestinian Judaism. And there, Sanders demonstrated very, very clearly that up to this point, New Testament scholars tended to perceive Judaism as a religion of law or legalism, and Christianity is the religion of grace. And sadly, this very way of viewing things is what really helped to perpetuate the Holocaust. So Sanders was doing this great thing, arguing that within Judaism and covenantal nomism, a framework of covenant thinking, Judaism is not a legalistic religion, and one's obedience to Torah is done out of love, and the kinds of things that basically you and I would say about the gospel. So he's demonstrating that this thing that we would want to call the gospel permeates Second Temple Judaism, excuse me. But what he's not able to do is enter into the theological world and ask about the implications of this. And this is what J.B. Phillips did with the help of John MacLeod Campbell. And MacLeod Campbell made a theological move that for me has been huge. And I hope you can appreciate this move that MacLeod Campbell makes. Again, Christ is the mediator between humans and God. or Jesus is the mediator between us and the Father, however you want to say this. MacLeod Campbell argues that Jesus mediates the Father to us. So when we see him, we see the Father. But Jesus also mediates us to the Father, so that when the Father sees us, he sees Jesus. I said last week that the Johannine emphasis is that the Father trusts the Son, and the Son trusts the Father. That's where this mediatorial business comes from, is really the fourth gospel. But MacLeod Campbell was able to take it an entire step further and say that in this mediation process, it is not a two-way street. The divine entrance into our world through Jesus the mediator creates both the possibility and the reality of our entry into the divine. And the whole thing is a gift. Now, some of you will recognize this in Baxter Kruger's work, correct? Right? Some of you that know the name Baxter Kruger. Baxter did his PhD under JB. So it's all there. And again, it's all part of, it's really fundamentally in the 20th century is developed by Karl Barth in the third volume of the Church Dogmatics, for those of you that want to go look that up. When we get in a talk here down the road about the relationship between economics and religion, one of the things that I hope you'll discover, like I discovered, is that I learned whatever I thought economics was, it isn't. And so if you've not studied economics, you don't have to study economics to understand economics. You have to study religion, and then you'll understand economics. Because as some of the Girardians like Paul Dumochel and Jean-Pierre Dupuy have pointed out, the modern economy has replaced ancient religion. The modern economy has replaced ancient religion. And we are seeing the dissolution of religion globally and this growing hegemony for about 400 years, 300 or 400 years, of the state, corporations, and the economy. So this is something to keep in mind as you think about doing church in the future, because church in the future, right now you got 72% of Americans attending church. In the future, it's going to be like post-war Europe. You might have 2% of the people attending church. So what does trust in the postmodern world and the world after that look like? And why is it important as we do Christian theology? First, the three terms, pistis, trust, euangelion, gospel, and charis, grace, are all three combined by the Apostle Paul over and over again, particularly in the letter to the Romans. Trust in the grace of the gospel. The gospel message is such that it is a gracious God who is calling to us, a God who is a covenant-making God, that's the MacLeod Campbell divine human side, and a covenant-keeping God, that's the human divine side in Jesus. If in fact God is a gracious God, that means God is not like the other gods. There are those in the New Testament that grasp this. The Apostle Paul saw it after his second conversion between the years 41 and 48 or 49. And that conversion is not recorded. But you can note that conversion by examining the Thessalonian letters written in 41, where Paul is still locked into that Second Temple Jewish eschatology. God's a nasty burger and he's going to get the enemies at the end. And by the time he writes Ephesians 8 or 9, 10 years later, 9 years later, according to Campbell, there's none of that. And you don't find a trace of it in his theology. Paul had abandoned the contractual God and the contractual gospel and the contractual worldview of Second Temple Judaism. He understood that the God of the gospel was a God who kept God's promises and kept God's promises even on our behalf in Jesus, and kept our promises to God in Jesus. In the world, once trust is broken because it's contractual, it's almost impossible to get back. You can ask any woman who's ever had a cheating husband. It's almost impossible to get back. It can be, but it's almost impossible. It's the same thing when you have a deep friendship. Betrayal creates such distrust that people are often unable to relate to that person after that. In the world of contracts, once trust is broken, you take a loan out from the bank and then you don't pay it back or you go bankrupt, you're going to get a second loan out of that bank? Probably not. Okay? Goes on your credit record. So all the banks know. In the church, there are no contracts, which means there are no transactions. If we are in the sphere of grace, we are only in the sphere of where there are debts, there is forgiveness. But we haven't lived that way. The Jews didn't live that way. And so so many of the prophets of ancient Judaism critique the category of usury. And usury is not interest. The difference between interest and usury is that interest is charged on commercial loans, business loans. That was legal throughout Judaism. But usury was charging interest on personal loans. And so you're a farmer and you've had a bad crop and you can't pay your taxes, and you come to me and you borrow the denarii so you can pay your taxes, and I charge you interest. And then next year's crop, you've got enough to sort of survive on, pay me a little bit, but really not the interest yet. And so I increase your interest. And then the third year you can't pay, then I take your daughter. And I tell you, I get her for 2 weeks a year. Do whatever I want with her. And she's now my servant. Theoretically, in Judaism, at the end of every 7 years, that system was to reverse. Land was to be returned. Families that had children that they had to sell out as slaves, those children got to come back. Same with wives. That's Jubilee, every 7 years. It didn't wipe out commercial interest between businesses, but it wiped out personal debt. In contracts, debt is everything. How many of you like owing somebody anything? I don't. I don't like that feeling at all. How many of you don't like having people owe you?
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So again, in the world where relationships function transactionally or contractually, we're in the world of debt. But in the church, if Lauren says, can I borrow $500, Michael, and I'll pay it back within 2 months, and then he's not able to do it, there's another category that applies, and that's forgiveness of the debt. So, because the relationship is more important than the debt. In the church, in the sphere of the ecclesia where Jesus is the Lord. This isn't realistic in our modern churches. I get that. but it's certainly the kind of language Paul uses when he talks about relating to one another, owe in no person anything except, check this one out, the debt of love. Tommy, how in the world can I possibly pay you back? I owe you a debt of love. Why the hell do I owe you a debt of love? What have you ever done for me? You know? No, but in the sphere of the ecclesia, this debt of love is, there's for us who know that we have lived lives like the Gentiles, and now we're in this new community. Our debt is this debt of this obligation to care for one another, to love one another. And love is patient, love is kind, love is loyal, love is true, all that stuff that love is. That's the new world in which we relate. And it is not contractual because it's forgiveness. Only 7 times a day. That's what Jesus said. You only have to forgive somebody 7 times a day. Did he say that? No. He said 70. And yet, how many of us have had children? And by the 2nd or 3rd time that they've done that thing, we're ready to kill them, right? We can't even get up to 7, let alone 7 times 70. So we've lost our imagination in the church sphere to be able to do this thing called trust with one another. And because we don't have that trust, we can't do theology. I mentioned last week that trust, or pistis, comes as a gift, not a charisma. Paul doesn't use the term charisma there, or chrism. There's no such thing as the gift of faith, like the gift of tongues or that. That's charisma. Gift here is doron, which is a present, just freely given, just, yeah, it's a present. And then I talked about trust and suffering. So now I want to come to the transition point for next week's talk. If in the modern world we have lost all the trust in the gods, including the Christian God, if in the modern world we've lost trust and faith in our institutions, our governments, our economic system, everything else, and if in the modern world we are especially reckoning with the fact that there's an awful lot of suffering going on, and we have these 2 things in mind, then we are able to make a connection that is missed more often than not, and that's that trust doesn't come when everything is copacetic. When everything's moving along like it should, and everybody's happy, and the bills are paid, and the boss is nice, and the wife is cool, and the kids are cool, or the partner's great, and on and on. When things that you don't need a lot of trust. It's when things go to hell, when life breaks down around you, that is when trust or fear are going to be nurtured. Suffering can produce fear, and often does. And that's why suffering can be so traumatic. There is another way to undergo suffering, and that is trust. Now, I'm talking about, in particular, social suffering. I'm not talking about, for example, a person that's being abused by another. In those situations, particularly in societies where you get the hell out of that relationship, just end of story. But in terms of how we, in this sphere called the ecclesia, the church, or those of us that worship the Father, the Son, and the Spirit and seek to understand and articulate that God, in that sphere, suffering is the soil in which the seed of trust can become a tree that blossoms and fruits. This is the challenge, because it is the suffering we inflict on each other that I'm talking about in the sphere of the church. Every single one of us has, well, that as far as I know, has left the institutional church because we suffered. I am here today to announce to you that within a decade, you're going to get replanted back in there because they're going to need you. Those of us that are alive, or you that are alive, they are going to need you because you will have learned how to develop trust in the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, and you will have learned how to articulate that in such a way that it is absolutely, truly good news, and you will be able to show the folly of anything else. Trust, therefore, begins in the same place that I said in the book, Knowing God, theology begins, from the cross. It is on the cross that we see Jesus trusting the Father. It's on the cross we see the Father trusting the Son. As I pointed out last time, Jesus did not call a legion of angels down to defend himself and wipe out the Romans and establish the kingdom of God on earth. He chose to suffer. Trust and theology both begin in a theology of the cross. Second, because of this, we now have the capacity to talk about the suffering God. In Gnosticism, in Gnostic religion, because the material world is evil and the spiritual world is good, what happens is, just as Jesus is getting ready to be crucified, the spiritual Christ leaves the human Jesus. And it's the human Jesus that gets nailed to the cross. But the spirit Christ stands above, laughing and mocking, because it's the human Jesus that's getting crucified, not the spirit Christ. And you'll see this in some interesting more, shall we say, liberal thinking in some Christologies out there. It's still just as Gnostic. But not only did the Son suffer on the cross as a human being, but as God. And so now we're talking language from the 2nd century called Patripassianism. Did the Father suffer while the Son suffered? Did the Father suffer while the Son suffered? I'm always surprised at how people immediately go Platonic on this. And they talk about God's immutable, he's unchangeable, and because he's immutable or unchangeable, he can't really suffer, because suffering brings change. That's why the Platonist early Christians said God can't suffer, only Jesus can suffer. But I don't know of a parent in this world that hasn't wept while their child died. And I think if you decide to go too Platonist too fast on the cross, you're just going to end up with a God who really doesn't give a shit about much, who becomes a divine watchmaker and winds up the universe and then kind of lets it go. So I think that where we start with trust and theology is that very place where we are little children in relation to a parent again, except you become as a little child. And then this also has direct implications for that which we call the gospel or atonement theory. If you have a covenant-making God, you cannot have an atonement theory that's transactional. And that means you're going to have to leave Anselm behind. It means you're going to have to leave Calvin behind. It means you're going to have to leave Origen behind, because God pays off the devil. There's a transaction. You're essentially going to have to leave behind almost the entirety of the Western Christian tradition. And that's an amazing statement to say. I don't like making those kinds of statements because they're too general, but that's just true. Once you allow transaction into your atonement theory, into your gospel, you don't have gospel anymore. Again, this is Paul's argument in the letter to the Galatians about the relationship between law and gospel. All of this fits together. So finally, if we're in a condition where we're suffering, and we are those who are called in the midst of that suffering to trust, is it not interesting that Jesus tells the parable of a widow and a judge who just doesn't give two shakes about her at all, because she's got nothing to bribe him with. And she keeps coming at him and coming at him and coming at him and coming at him. Every day she's out there on the picket line or on the protest line, or she's hollering at him when he's coming out of the building to get on his donkey and head home, and finally he just gives in. He says, the only way I'm ever going to get rid of this woman is to give her whatever the hell she wants. So what is it you want? Okay, fine, done. Now leave me alone. And we turn that parable into a story about us and God. Is God like that? Is the Father like that? Is the Father someone you got to pray to and pray harder and pray mightier and pray louder and pray stronger and ask and ask and ask and command and demand until finally, divinity relents just to get rid of you? God is not like the unjust judge. Did I say that right? God is not. Yeah, God is not like the unjust judge. And that's why immediately following that parable is a saying that the parable scholars, they can't connect it. They can't connect it. So you got Bultmann and others going, the early church added it on as a moral conclusion. And it's the saying, when the Son of Man returns, will he find pistis on earth? Here's a woman suffering great injustice, banging on the doors of heaven, bang, bang, clang, clang, louder, louder, bigger, bigger, She's not exhibiting pistis. She's this woman in relation to this judge is the way religious people are in relation to God or the gods, and that's what Jesus is pointing out. There's a big difference between the judge and the Father and the widow and ourselves. So as the world goes through great suffering, and it will continue, it's going to get bad, folks. Over this, while we're together here learning theology the next decade, the world's going to go through a maelstrom. And as it does, we will be those who will have learned to trust. And we'll be there for each other, and we'll share together, and hopefully we'll get to meet each other and those kinds of things. But it's our task. It's our calling, and it's the gift to us. Because without trust, we cannot do theology. We can't. Because we don't have the components that are necessary at that point to do theology. Oh, you could go teach it in a university. You could say what people think and what they believe, but you cannot actually do speech before God theology apart from trust. Without trust, there is no theology. There's just intellectualizing of religious ideas. And I will turn